August is here, and that means that the weather and the election cycle are heating up. The best way to beat the heat and stay up to date on the latest news from the US election to international breaking headlines is to become a DSR member and gain access to additional content across our network, in addition to other exclusive benefits. Use code BEATTHEHEAT to get 50% off of your membership and sign up today at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. That's Beat the Heat at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. Now please enjoy the show.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. A new batch of polls just came out that are very good news for Kamala Harris. The Cook Political Report's highly regarded surveys found her leading Donald Trump or tied with him in 6 of the 7 key battleground states. What's crucial here, however, is that her lead in part reflects real success against Trump among independent voters and also among voters who don't like either Trump or President Biden. So far, despite all the attacks on Harris as a DEI hire and crazy leftist and so forth, she seems to be holding up as broadly acceptable to large swaths of the electorate. So today we're talking to Reed Galen, a veteran former Republican strategist and never-Trumper, who was working to win over independent and moderate voters to Harris for the pro-democracy group Join the Union. He's going to help us break down what's really going on with these voters. So good to have you on, Reed.
No, Greg, thanks for having me.
So the Cook Political Report poll, which is very highly regarded, finds that Kamala Harris is leading Trump by 48 to 43 in Pennsylvania, 46 to 44 in Michigan, 48 to 43 in Wisconsin, 46 to 42 in Arizona, and even by 46 to 44 in North Carolina. Georgia's tied at 46, and only in Nevada does Trump lead. Now, Reed, those numbers sound a bit too good to be true in the Sun Belt, but in the 3 blue wall states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, it's pretty much in line with other polls, maybe a bit high for Harris. What's your reading of these numbers?
I think that what you're seeing is, let's call it a rebound or a boomerang of Democratic enthusiasm that frankly had significantly waned when President Biden was still at the top of the ticket. I mean, in our own research, we saw that even before the debate, Greg, the president's age in particular was really weighing down on his numbers. And so what I think you're seeing is that the Democrats do something that they don't often do, which was when they realized they had a new option, an option, frankly, that could win, they all got in line. They got in a hurry. They got excited. They remain excited as we approach now the Democratic National Convention. Tim Walz seems to be an inspired choice. And so I think you're seeing that, August, which is normally a sleepy political month, has woken up a lot of Democratic voters who were, nervous Nellies, which they often are, a lot of independent voters who were tuned out. And I think a lot of Republican voters, like I used to be, who said, wait a second, to your point about the people who don't like either. Well, I don't know much about her, but I'm curious, and let's see what she wants to talk about.
Well, the media narrative about this race right now is that Harris is enjoying a honeymoon. The Dem base is really jazzed, as you said. She's getting lots of media attention, and that this all just has to subside a bit once the millions in GOP attack ads painting her as a radical take their toll. And this is why I wanted to do an episode about these polls. They find the Cook polls, they find that right now she's remaining broadly acceptable across many groups. In those 7 battlegrounds, she's leading Trump by 48 to 40 among independents. And those double haters, the ones who dislike both Trump and Biden, she's winning by 30 points, 54 to 24. Can you talk a little bit more about what's going on with these voters? I mean, you're doing a lot of research among them, right? What's the story?
Yeah. So, thanks for mentioning that. So one of our allied groups, the Lincoln Democracy Institute, we do a lot of research on this. And what I think you're seeing too is that there were a lot of otherwise independent voters who, again, to your point, they didn't like either one of them. So they were just going to stay home. Now they have a viable option, right? I think this is one thing that's really misunderstood or not talked about enough, Greg, is that Donald Trump, with the exception of 2016, has been electoral poison. What he says and does is not broadly popular. The policy prescriptions that he either laid out or tried to carry out during his presidency or is laid out in the context of Project 2025 are broadly unpopular. The Dobbs decision is broadly unpopular, certainly with Democrats and certainly with women. So I'm not surprised by any of this. And I will also say this, there's something that we're seeing too, and this is sort of a good news, bad news. Good news for Kamala Harris, sort of bad news for how far the bar has fallen, Greg, is there are a lot of people who said she's not over the age of 70 and she can string two sentences together, right? The people are just looking for somebody literally competent and confident and lacking in the chaos they believe that maybe a second Biden term would have, become because they were concerned about his age, or one we're sure to get if Donald Trump is reelected.
Well, I want to pick up on what you said there, because I think it gets at something important. I really think our media discourse misses something about this race, and has all along, that a lot of voters see Trump as dangerously unstable and crazy, that a lot of voters have big problems with Trump's temperamental fitness for the presidency. I mean, as long as the relentless focus was on Biden's feebleness, concerns about Trump along those lines were obscured. But now that Biden's out of the way, concerns about Trump's lunacy and dangerous instability are coming to the fore. Is that what you're seeing among these independent and moderate voters? I mean, how are they processing all these signals?
Well, I think that's right. But let's go back even to the Republican primary, such as it was. If you remember that in the Iowa caucuses back in January, I know that sounds like a lifetime ago, there were a fair number of Nikki Haley voters, and something I think like 25% of those caucus goers. And remember, Greg, as you know, a caucus goer is not like an average voter. This is somebody who goes out to a church in the middle of a snowstorm to cast a ballot. 25% of those people said that if Donald Trump was the Republican nominee, they were going to vote for Joe Biden. Now, that was a long time ago. But even through, the later primaries into a place like Indiana, Nikki Haley was picking up 15 or 20% of Republican primary voters. Again, those are the diehards, the people that turn out all the time. He has not locked up all of his base. Trump hasn't. And so, yes, that extreme part of the Republican Party might be 40 or 50 or 60% now, right, as opposed to when I was a Republican. But again, he's got a lot of trouble. And I would say this is one thing we shouldn't sleep on, as we saw in 2020. What killed Trump in a place like Wisconsin was the undervote. Remember that, and Ron Johnson even said this on tape, he said 50,000 Republican voters could have pulled a lever for Trump, left President blank. That's the difference between Trump winning and losing. And I think you're going to see a lot of that too, which is maybe they don't know a lot about Kamala Harris, but they know Republicans and conservative-leaning independents know, I don't want him back. And he has almost no margin for error.
I want to return to the Cook Political Report polls for a sec. There's still a vulnerability here for Harris in them. In those battlegrounds, 53% say they're concerned she's too liberal to govern effectively, but more, 57%, say Trump is too erratic and out of control to govern effectively. And Harris is tied with Trump on who makes voters feel safer, which is amazing because that's Trump's whole campaign attack, that he's strong and Harris is weak. So I want to ask, what do you think about what the Republican attack machine is doing on Harris right now? We've got the absurd lies about the border and crime, the obvious racialized imagery. Do these numbers show the attack machine is failing in some sense, or should we still worry that once these attacks sink in, they'll start to work?
I think both. I think both of those things can exist in the same place. I think that the idea that the Trump campaign didn't at least believe there was a good chance that Joe Biden would step aside and didn't have a fusillade ready to go for Kamala Harris is just frankly political malpractice. And I don't want Trump to win, right? But if I were on his campaign and I said, okay, guys, this doesn't look like he's going to make it, right? We should probably have something in the can. That would have been a no-brainer. But now I'm hearing that, now they want to save their fire because it's been, she's been on this high. She's got her convention coming up. Now they're going to wait till after Labor Day. Like, that doesn't make any sense either, Greg. And so what I would say is this, is that the thing that Harris has going for her is that she has dynamism. She has Big Mo, as George H.W. Bush would have called it. And she is able to, and I think if they do this right, they should be able to spend the next basically 10 days defining her, Democrats, I mean. Trump is defined. He is who he is. And I believe that if Democratic groups and allied groups, including many independents and Republicans like myself who want nothing more to do with Donald Trump as president, go to work on him while they are putting more air underneath her, I think that it will get much uglier. There's no question about it. The question I have is whether or not that ugliness reinforces for people who and what Trump is, or takes any points off of Harris. Now, it might. But again, if you were going to be doing this as just a political practitioner, you would have started a month ago. And so far, it looks like they're going to give her 8 weeks of clean air. And all the talk about, she doesn't meet with the press and Tim Walz and it, like, that's not something that I think breaks through to individual voters. Like, they don't care what the New York Times thinks. New York Times beat reporters think about whether or not Kamala Harris should come see them in the scrum line.
They probably don't. Let's bring in some other numbers. A new Quinnipiac poll finds that Harris is up 48 to 45 in Pennsylvania. But what really struck me is that Harris is hitting Biden-level numbers among non-college whites in Pennsylvania. I think, according to the 2020 exit polls, Biden got 34% of them. In the Quinnipiac poll, Harris is at 33% of them, even though Biden is Scranton Joe and she's a California liberal. Now, you guys have to be working with a fair amount of blue-collar whites because that demographic is heavily represented among these kind of undecided and middle-of-the-road voters and so forth. What do you think's going on with that demographic and Harris here?
I think it's a number of things. One, I think it might be some just flat-out Trump fatigue. It's one thing to be – think about this, Greg. Think about the idea of being angry. Right? Anger is typically an emotion that burns hot and fast. And Trump asks for unbridled rage and anger from his people all the time. And that is frankly exhausting. Secondly, I think this is where policy may have an impact, which is, if you want a job for the most part in this country, you could probably have one. Have prices gone up? For sure they have. But I think you might see that, Biden's economic policies and the Fed might be helping average Americans. And then lastly, again, I think this is something new, right? Someone new, someone who can break the mold. We thought we were going to have two people we already saw. We thought we were going to have two people we were sort of both sick of. But now we have a new option. We have a new opportunity. And so, look, I think that, again, if that number goes from 33 to 37, like, Trump's cooked. There's just no way he can win.
Reed, I think that she probably wins if she's at 33 or 34 among that demographic in Pennsylvania.
I agree. And that's why, to me, look, as an old Republican, that's why I say, Greg, pour it on, right? Pour it on. You're going to have all the money you need. You're going to have all the energy you need. Like, go after it, right? Go to the T in Pennsylvania, right? Go to Erie, go to Northeast Pennsylvania, go to south of Allegheny County. Like, just go there and at least put pressure on Trump. If they're pulling stakes in Ohio, if they're down in North Carolina, Greg, this is now the strategic problem that the Trump campaign has, is as they thought they might have against an energized Biden, 12 months ago, is where are we going to win? It's not where we're going to lose. It's not where we're going to, it's not where we're going to be successful. It's now where the hell can we pick up a win?
Well, it is interesting how Harris seems to have really put the Sun Belt very much back in play. The Biden team had essentially written it off. It was gone for Biden, I think. And that brings me to...
Yeah, absolutely. Right? It was,
yeah,
for sure.
And so that brings me to this new Equus poll, also highly regarded, finds Harris leading Trump among Latinos in the 7 key swing states by nearly 20 points, 56 to 37. This dovetails with another poll from the Somos PAC last week, which had it at 55-37 among Latinos in the battlegrounds. Now, this goes back to what you said earlier. Harris really is both reigniting and reconstituting the Democratic base. Now, I don't think she's still where she has to be with Latinos, but it's pretty close. And improving on that seems eminently doable, doesn't it? Let me ask you that, and also as a former Republican strategist who worked for George W. Bush, who also did very well among Latinos for a Republican, how seriously do you take Trump's gains among Hispanics?
Let me start with your second question first. I take them seriously enough because I think the Democratic Party fundamentally, and I say this across a lot of their voter cohorts, Greg, I think they fundamentally misunderstand a lot of their own base. right? What Trump speaks to and Republicans speak to are values and culture, right? Trump goes out and he talks about family and he talks about hard work and he talks about self-reliance. And those are cultural values shared by the Latino community, the African-American community, the Asian American community, right? So that is one of those things where I think that Trump stole about a quarter of a march, not a whole march, but about a quarter of a march on it. I think the other part too that you've seen is a shifting of some conservative Latino Catholics to becoming conservative Latino evangelicals, where the lining up of vote in evangelicalism is almost always 1-to-1 Republican, right? Now, the other part I would say, though, is that remember that when Trump thought he was going to pound Joe Biden into the ground, they had signs, professionally printed signs at his convention saying mass deportation. Now, and this is one thing that, like, I wish, some people in the media, a lot of people in the media would be asking is, what does that mean? What does that actually mean? Because who are you going to deport? How are you going to determine who's here undocumented, who's here naturalized, who's been here, who was born here, right? Are you going to go to a multifamily apartment complex and start yanking people out of apartments, right? How do you think that's going to work? If you did that, where are you going to put these people? Who's going to protect them? What are the rules of engagement? Are you going to deputize local and state officials to help you do this stuff? And I think that once you start asking those questions, it becomes far more than just a border issue, right? Which is, I think, far more nuanced and complicated and complex than we often make it out for. But if you start asking that question, not only do I think you create a very legitimate concern amongst the Latino population, I think you create a legitimate concern among all Americans who don't like the idea of stormtroopers kicking in doors.
Well, look, I think you raise a really important point there, both for the broader electorate and for Latinos, which is that Trump's signs at the convention, which said mass deportations now, something like that, were this expression of supreme confidence and certainty that they were going to win, right? They didn't have to moderate even a tiny bit. Now, all of a sudden, it's nearly a 20-point gap among Latinos. But critically, in some of the polling, a path to legalization also polls well among Latinos. So, for instance, the sweet spot for Democrats right now is more border security. Harris would sign the Republican negotiated border security deal, but also path to legalization for key groups that are here. And importantly, she said that in her Sunbelt swing. She said that, and the press basically missed it. And that's how you get Latinos, right, with that combination.
Well, I think that's right. But I also think that it's an important part now for all of these democratically aligned groups, the think tanks and the C4s and the C3s, to really also be extolling the virtues of the economic impact of immigrants,
100%.
Right? Just to go back to the mass deportation thing, think about this, Greg. Like, how do you fill an 11 million person economic hole in the economy? How do you do that? Right? Where do those people come from? Where do you make it up? Right? The other part too is if you have crossed, and there was an incredibly sad, moving story in this month's Atlantic about a reporter covering the Darien Gap coming out of Colombia, I think, and into Panama. If you have risked life and limb of your family and your children to come here, I'm not saying we shouldn't 100% know who you are and there shouldn't be a process, but you've already told us you're willing to be part of the fabric of America, right? You are willing to work hard and be here, and we need more of that, not less. And so I would say this is, you can do both. And I would also, just to go back to what you said about the legislation, I would be beating Trump and Republicans in both House and Senate races over the head with the fact that when they had a chance to have real border security legislation passed, they didn't do it because it would hurt Trump, right? And so they've made their bed with this guy. They've made their deal with the devil. And I frankly hope each and every one of them pays for it.
Well, look, Democrats have for the longest time been afraid of this issue, and I think wrongly, because there is a strong argument to make which combines border security plus the idea that you articulated, which is that immigrants are good for our country as long as we manage the flow in a way that benefits the national interest, which we can do. But let me ask you, Reed, you've been around Republican politics a long time. So for as long as I've been following this stuff, the Republican attack machine has been kind of hyped into this terrifying force. Like, once it unleashes, it destroys any Democrat in its path and so forth. But I can't help but notice that the swift voting attempt that launched on Harris's running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, just hasn't been that effective. And the attacks on Harris seem weak and silly, at least for now. So, big picture, what do you make of the current version of the attack machine? How does it relate to past versions, ones that you had a hand in running?
Sure.
Has something changed in some fundamental sense? Is it less effective? Is something different about our information ecosystem? What do you make of it all?
Well, I think there's again, as I noted earlier, I think there's some wariness of it. And I think that it is less effective. I think it's less effective is because of something you said, which is its chief messenger is less effective. I mean, Greg, you and I are old enough to remember mixtapes, right? I mean, Donald Trump is an old mixtape that's been run through the cassette player so many times. It's got like blank spaces and pops and whistles and cracks. Like, he doesn't have anything new to say. And so the things they say just aren't landing like they used to. I think the other part too, and this is something that I'm very happy to see that Democrats learned, and I give all the credit in the world to the vice president and the second gentleman, is they weren't going to sit back and take it. They weren't going to take the bait, right? That has always been the Democrats' Achilles heel. It's not necessarily whether or not Republicans attack. Republicans attack, and frankly, Democrats do too if they want to. But it's that Republicans would attack, Democrats would try and answer the charge with some rationality and normalcy, which never works because the Republicans' attacks are inherently irrational and now mostly unbelievable. I mean, if you go back to something that has been part and parcel of Republican politics for generations, right? The Willie Horton ad of 1988, right? Now, that wasn't a George H.W. Bush campaign ad, right? But it did have the effect of impugning Michael Dukakis as soft on crime, and it scared the hell out of white people, okay? Which was its job. And there was some resonance. This man had done this thing, if that makes sense. Now, they live in an alternate information universe of their own creation. And when they try and communicate outside that universe, they find far less willing takers, if that makes sense. They're so encapsulated in their own bubble that otherwise normal human beings are like, really? And here's the other part, too. If Kamala Harris is elected, yes, she will be our first woman and, first woman of color elected. We have elected a black president, right? Barack Obama shattered that idea that it wasn't possible. And so now there are a lot of, I think certainly, any voter under the age of probably 40, right, who maybe cast their first ballot for Barack Obama. The idea that a black woman is running for president is important on some symbolic level, but is not like inherently or immediately disqualifying, if that makes sense, which is Chris LaCivita and Susie Wiles are using 1988 tactics in a 2024 environment.
Well, I think that's really critical. And I think white America is just not the same as it was in the 1980s. And one really big tell for me was that in 2020, when Trump made the campaign against Biden all about the police protests, be it Black Lives Matter and so forth, and the entire press corps and punditry stated with absolute confidence that there was no way Democrats could win this debate, right? I mean, Republicans always win when it's about race and policing. And yet, Biden actually fought it to a draw among white voters. And that, to me, was a sign that white America is more educated. Basic realities about racial injustice are much more present in people's minds.
Well, and I would say this, I don't know, Greg, if anybody's ever done an analysis of that particular issue, but it's one I think about a fair bit in the context of 2020, which is, I think that, to your point, I think there were a lot of white American voters who, when Trump said something like, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, which basically gave free rein to federal, state, and local law enforcement to go kick the hell out of everybody they could or pepper spray anybody that got in their way. I think that was a massive, massive blow to Donald Trump's reelection efforts because, to your point, I think there were a lot of Americans writ large, but a lot of white Americans who didn't want to believe that was the country they still lived in.
And I think Trump is campaigning as if none of that is actually real.
Right, because that's his existence lacks reality on a moment by moment basis.
Right. He just, on some really fundamental level, he doesn't really act as if he lost in 2020. And to go back to your initial point, Trump and MAGA just essentially treat the last 3 national elections, which they lost, as if they never happened. And I think we're seeing that right now with their campaigning against Harris.
If Trump continues to slide, if his support continues to erode, we should not be under any illusion that this will not get uglier than anything we've ever seen, that they will pull out every last stop they have to try and just scare the hell out. And listen, let's be clear. This is going to be about predominantly white suburban voters in target states. They're going to do everything. They're going to say everything that no one else could ever imagine saying out loud. And let's be clear, Republicans have said a lot of things out loud over the decades. And I think that will, frankly, ultimately backfire on them. But we should not underestimate the effect it will have on our body politic and our national psyche.
It's going to be really disgusting, Reed. Well, Reed Galen, thanks for coming on with us today.
Thanks for having me, and I hope everybody will check us out at jointheunion.us.
You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler and the DSR Network.